So, interesting question. I know this one comes up a lot, and maybe you've answered it in the past. But the Christian tradition is burial at death.
Yes.
And yet, we worship a God who's big and would probably have no problem taking cremated remains and reassembling them back. So,
Yes.
but is there a biblical position that says one of those two choices or a third choice would be more appropriate for the Christian believer?
There actually is not. What you're going to read in the Bible is what was Middle Eastern, what was appropriate at the time. For example, they viewed it that if bodies were burned by an external person, an enemy, that was a dishonor. There was the don't leave the bodies out. Make sure that you hurry up and get them into the ground. That was another thing, especially depending on Passover. They have a lot of rules that we actually don't have. They didn't have the embalming process. They don't go through, even if we do burial, we actually do it in a totally different way than they do it. They had certain tombs that we don't have tombs like that. We have burial coffins in the ground in a different way. They would put them in rock, or they would have a bunch of different ways of doing it. So trying to be biblical in how we bury people is probably not likely. We don't even have those options in our society. What does God need us to do? He doesn't need us to do anything. Here's the idea. The reason why cremation is no big deal at all is because God doesn't need solid parts to put back together. And here's why. The Bible says that when the dead are raised, that the sea gives up those that are in them. Well, I don't know if you know anything about decomposition of the human body in the ocean, but there's no parts left. So what is the sea giving back up? Come on, seriously? Little fishies have already done away with whatever was there. So God doesn't need the parts. He is very capable of making man out of dust and making man out of dust again. He's actually very good at that. It's not a problem for him. So our method of burial is not of consequence. There is no concerns there one way or another, because ultimately every one of those things can happen by nature, and God can still work with them, and has likely demonstrated that. You have to remember that some martyrs were burned at the stake. A lot of martyrs were burned at the stake. And they are not precious in the sight of the Lord, that they are not fully dwelling in his presence, that they don't have transformed bodies? Of course they do. The Bible says very clearly they do. But they were incinerated. So I don't think we need to have any concerns whatsoever about method of burial.